Hello everyone, Mr. Walker here. This lesson that we're going to be going over today can be considered the first lesson of the Biology 30 program that goes along with the first unit. So kind of an introduction and an overview to eventually what we're going to be covering in this first unit. So as the title says here, it's going to be on what are referred to collectively as the regulatory or the control systems. Many organs and systems in your body, but there are two of them in particular that we'll talk about here that oversee the functioning of many of the other systems in your body. So I'd like to use the analogy to start things off of a thermostat as we see here, and this will nicely lead into how these regulatory systems do work within your body. So if we just talk a little bit about the functioning of a thermostat, this one here unfortunately shows that it's in degrees Fahrenheit rather than Celsius, but that's okay. So what a thermostat is going to do, whether it's in your house or a school or anywhere else, is it actually does a number of different things. So what you do is you set the temperature that you want to have that room at, and that is what we refer to as the set point for that particular room, and that is the set point for the thermostat that you're using. So what the thermostat needs to be able to do is then measure what the actual temperature of the room is. So there needs to be some sort of mechanism, without getting into all the details, for a thermostat to actually take a sampling of the temperature of the room. So if the temperature of the room is, and again, we won't go by this one here, the 72, but we'll go by, say, a normal room temperature, and let's make it, well, kind of comfortable and warm, 25 degrees Celsius as our set point. So if the temperature goes above or below this, the very first thing that this thermostat has to be able to do is to realize that the temperature is no longer at the set point. Only once that recognition is made can steps then be taken in order to bring it back to the set temperature. And then, once that temperature has been returned to the set point, once again, the thermostat has to recognize that, so we don't have the temperature going in the opposite direction. So a fairly complicated device. So the temperature is doing the sensing, the thermostat rather is doing the sensing of the temperature. The thermostat is doing the processing or interpreting of the information and comparing it to the set point, but it's not actually warming up the room or cooling off the room. That would, of course, be a furnace or the air conditioning. So there does need to be some connection to these other mechanical systems in order to lead to the change in the temperature as well. So regulatory systems overall, like the thermostat, what they are in place for in your body is to maintain, well, a very important word here, what is referred to as homeostasis, which is either defined as maintaining stable or ideal internal conditions despite of changes to the external environment. So if we think about temperature, this is something that your body needs to maintain under very fine control. So normal human body temperature is about 37 degrees Celsius plus or minus 0.5 degrees. So that would be considered the sort of ideal condition, the ideal temperature under normal conditions. So abnormal conditions might be something like when someone is sick, and then the actual ideal temperature might be a little bit higher in order to help to combat whatever that infection is. But normally, under normal conditions, the stable or the ideal temperature would be, again, about the 37 degrees Celsius. So just like the thermostat, one of your body's functions is to ensure that you are maintaining homeostasis. If the temperature gets too high, it creates significant problems. And if the temperature gets too low, that also creates significant problems within your body. So yes, the body needs to be able to monitor the changes in the internal and external environment. And just like the thermostat, it needs to be able to make some sort of a response in order to maintain the ideal internal conditions. So for the thermostat, I talked about a set point. In your body as well, there's also going to be a set point for your body temperature, along with a number of other things that need to be maintained under fairly fine control. So overall, this is what a thermostat does, and overall, this is what a regulatory system in your body has to do as well. You can't make a response until you take a sampling in the first place. So your body has to, first of all, detect something. So we're talking about temperature. Your body needs to be able to measure, take a sampling of the internal core temperature. And then it needs to be able to compare it to the standard. So the standard is 37 degrees Celsius. And just like with the thermostat, if it's not at the set point, then it's going to lead to some sort of a response. So in your body, in order to regulate your body temperature, for example, so if the temperature gets too cold, your body is going to detect that. It's going to compare it to the standard. Your body is going to determine that. The regulatory systems will determine that the body temperature is too low, and then a response to the low body temperature would be shivering, and it would be constriction of your peripheral blood vessels to lead to less loss of heat. If the temperature is too high, then we of course wouldn't get the shivering, and the blood vessels on the periphery of your body, instead of constricting, they would dilate, and that would allow for an increased release of heat to go along with things like sweating as well, in order to decrease your body temperature. So we always have to have this pattern: detect something, compare it to the standard or set value, and then eventually get a response. So two systems that we're going to talk about now, or at least get into, at least introducing, that are the regulatory systems in your body. And this is the first unit of Biology 30. It is on the nervous system, the major regulatory system in your body, and the major regulatory organ then would be the brain. We also have the endocrine system, though. The endocrine system involves glands that are scattered throughout your body, and these glands produce signaling molecules that are dumped into the blood, and they're referred to as hormones. So unlike with the nervous system, where we have kind of a central structure, the brain and the spinal cord to some extent, that's responsible for regulation, for the endocrine system, some of these glands are located in your brain as well, some of them located in your neck, in your thoracic area, abdominal area, and in the pelvic region as well. So scattered in various different locations throughout your body for the endocrine system, which is also referred to as the hormonal system, because hormones are produced. So what are some of the conditions that need to be kept relatively stable? Well, we already talked about one of them, of course, so this is a big one for sure, and it is body temperature, but many other ones that do need to be maintained under very fine control. So let me just jot down a number of these. These certainly wouldn't be all of them, but a fairly comprehensive list that I'll put down here. Oxygen, the amount of oxygen in your body fluids that's accessible to your cells for cytorespiration, that needs to be maintained. Carbon dioxide that is produced through cytorespiration. Too much carbon dioxide is going to lead to a change in pH. It in fact lowers the pH and makes your blood more acidic. So these two here kind of go hand in hand. They need to be controlled in terms of homeostasis. Other things in your blood, different salts and ions. So sodium ions, potassium ions are under fine control. What goes along with those is the amount of water in your body, determining things like your osmotic pressure, and also having a direct impact on something else that needs to be under very fine control. I'll just put it down here as BP, but your blood pressure. So we have a number of different things here, and again, this isn't everything that needs to be maintained under homeostasis in your body, but a fairly nice sampling of a number of different things that do need to be kept under fine control, and this involves, as we will see eventually, both the nervous and the endocrine systems. So why two different systems? Because what we're going to find is that quite often they might do exactly the same thing. So in terms of increasing the amount of oxygen that's available in your body, that could involve both the nervous and the endocrine system. So why two systems? Why not just have one system? Well, there's a little bit of a difference in the mechanism by which they act. And this is kind of important, especially, it's kind of a favorite in terms of questions on exams. The nervous system, when it responds to a change in the environment, the response is really quick. We're talking about on the order of very few seconds, or maybe even milliseconds. So extremely rapid in terms of the changes to changes in the environment. But the responses involving the nervous system, they typically don't last that long. They're fairly short-lived. So with the endocrine system involving the hormones, we might get exactly the same response, only now it takes a little bit longer to actually get that response. but the response that you do get, it's going to be longer lasting. So yes, it is important that you kind of keep this straight, the overall kind of difference between these two regulatory systems. So again, the nervous system is really quick, but the response isn't all that long lasting. Endocrine system is a little bit slower to respond, but the response is much longer lasting with the endocrine system. Just like with the thermostat, there always needs to be some feedback. So once the temperature of the room reaches the set point, if it's the furnace that has been turned on, well, now you have to turn the furnace off. Otherwise, the temperature of the room becomes too warm. And a very similar mechanism that takes place with your body, there always needs to be feedback just in terms of, was it an appropriate response, yes or no, and was it enough of a response? So if there is a response and it was the appropriate response, was it enough? Do we need to do more of it, or can we shut off that response? So that all involves feedback, and there are two different kinds of feedback. So the one that I mentioned is really a negative feedback. That is going to turn off a response that was previously initiated. Positive feedback is exactly the opposite. Instead of turning off the response, it's actually going to enhance it even more. So once you get a response, it leads to even more and more of a response. Most of the ones that we're going to be talking about in terms of feedback, as we will see eventually, are going to involve the negative. Just a couple of them that we'll touch on that involve the positive feedback. So we'll take a look at a couple of diagrams here. I have provided for you in your handout some blank diagrams to go along with this. So the idea is for you to now fill in those handouts that you have with the information that we're going to see on this slide. So this is just a summary with what I already talked about. So there can be many different stimuli. So what are those stimuli? Temperature, osmotic pressure, the amount of salt and water in your body, pH, the amount of oxygen. All of these can be different kinds of stimuli, and all of these have to be controlled. So all of them are under homeostatic control. All of them have a set point within your body. So what you have to have is some way to detect them. So in the case of the thermostat, that is the sensor. That is where the receptors are for temperature. In the case of your body, there will be sensors in different parts of your body depending upon what the stimulus is and what it is that we're trying to regulate under homeostatic control. But you do need to have some way of detecting the stimulus in the first place, otherwise it is impossible to get a response. So now that information is now passed to the control center. So for the most part, that is going to be the brain when we're talking about the nervous system, and it would be processing taking place within the glands when we're talking about the endocrine system. So here is where the question is asked, are we at homeostasis, or is whatever the stimulus is that we are measuring, is it for some reason out of homeostasis? So if it is out of homeostasis, then something needs to be done. So what actually carries out the action? The general term that we use is going to be effectors. So if it again is temperature, if your body temperature is too low, if that is the stimulus, if that is detected, if that is what is processed by the control center, the effectors in this case would then be your peripheral blood vessels. So that's going to be a target, and they're going to constrict so you don't lose as much heat through your skin. And it's going to target the muscles, and that's going to lead to the shivering as well. So those would be the effectors in the case of the body temperature being too low. So yes, that's a response that you get. That is one example of a response that you could get in terms of a lower body temperature. And now once you get that response, the idea again is to bring it back to homeostasis. So once it's back to homeostasis, then the negative feedback kicks in. So if your body temperature went from 37 to 36, all of these mechanisms would kick in, but once it's brought back up to 37 degrees Celsius, you no longer have to do this anymore. In fact, the stimulus has been removed. You're no longer stimulating the sensor. You're no longer sending information to the control center saying that the temperature is too cold. The effectors are not activated, and you no longer get the response. So that's kind of the point behind the negative feedback. On the right-hand side, yes, we do have the positive feedback as well. So here it's just exactly the opposite. So once you get a response, it's going to enhance it, and you're going to get even more of a response. So more effectors are going to be turned on, and that's going to enhance the response that eventually you get. So we'll take a look at just a couple of examples here. All of the stuff in this presentation, by the way, there's not a lot of it that's memorization material, except for really those 2 points that I mentioned in terms of big differences between the nervous and the endocrine system. So the rest of this, again, is just kind of an overview so for eventually where we're going for the rest of the unit. So some really, really nice examples here of how the body most definitely is brought out of homeostasis, and very, very, very quickly, and for a number of different parameters. So the picture at the top, what we're taking a look at is a hospital setting, an emergency room, a trauma setting, and I can see what looks like a cycling helmet here. So this might be a cyclist that has fallen off his bike, or maybe being hit by a vehicle, and looks like they have a traction splint on here, so maybe this person actually has a broken femur. That's what it kind of looks like. There might be some other things going on as well, but for sure with a broken femur, that is a trauma situation that most definitely will bring the person's body out of homeostasis very, very quickly. Exercise, that's the picture at the bottom here that we're taking a look at. So here it is, cycling, road cycling, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be any other exercise. As soon as you start that exercise, there are some things immediately that are thrown out of whack in terms of homeostasis. Some of them take a little bit longer, when in terms of the duration of the exercise. It might take a while for some others to kick in, but in both cases here, the trauma setting and in exercise, your body is taken away from homeostasis. So again, you have a blank for this one here, and I do want to stress once again that there's nothing really memorization from this slide and from your handout. It's just to kind of get a feel for the mechanism that is involved. So in the case of that previous picture, the trauma setting, that's what this diagram is going to go along with, although it could actually go along with exercise as well. So here the controlled variable, and something in a trauma setting that is of really primary concern, is blood pressure. So if that person that's laying down had broken their femur, they're going to be losing a lot of blood, which means the blood pressure is going to drop. And if it drops too much, then you no longer have a sufficient amount of blood to circulate around to your most vital of the organs, which are going to be your brain and your heart. So critical in a trauma setting that blood pressure is maintained. But in a trauma setting, that's brought out of homeostasis very quickly by the loss of blood and the loss of body fluids. So we have a drop in the blood pressure. So your body has specialized sensors, and that is their job, is to specifically measure blood pressure. They're called baroreceptors. They're located in large arteries coming out of your heart, the aorta, largest artery in your body, and the carotid arteries that deliver blood up toward your brain. That's where you have these sensors. They're going to pass this information on to the processor of this information, which happens to be a region of your brain, which is referred to as the brain stem. And that's the part of the brain that takes a look at the information and kind of says, well, the blood pressure is too low, so now we need to do something about it. So it's going to target the effectors. So effectors that I have in this case are going to be the heart and blood vessels. So the point here is to bring the body back into homeostasis. The blood pressure is dropped. So this is going to be an attempt at least to, well, if not bring the blood pressure back up, at least maintain the blood pressure and maintain the circulation of blood going to the heart and to the brain. So what is going to happen with the heart? Well, it's going to increase the rate of contraction. What does this do? Well, it's going to be one of the factors that's going to increase the cardiac output, and that's going to increase the blood pressure. Another effector on the right-hand side are blood vessels. You only have so much blood, about 5 liters of blood, and if you break a femur, then chances are you lose at least 1 liter, 20% of your blood. So you want to try and maintain the blood pressure by decreasing the volume inside of the blood vessels. So it's also going to lead to blood vessel constriction. So this is going to be the result of both the nervous and the endocrine system. So division of the nervous system that we'll see in another lesson, the sympathetic nervous system is activated during a stress situation like this, and that's going to directly target the heart and the blood vessels and lead to these responses that we see here. And also this hormone, norepinephrine and epinephrine, they're going to be released and they're going to circulate around. They're going to target exactly the same heart and blood vessels, and it's all going to be an attempt in order to maintain the blood pressure and restore the blood pressure. Usually restoring the blood pressure in a trauma setting will require more than this. It would also require intravenous or replacing the blood that has been lost. So the next one here, this is the one that goes along with the exercise. But again, this could also fit in with the trauma setting. So immediately when someone starts to exercise, regardless of what that exercise is, there's an increased demand for oxygen. Your cells need oxygen for cytorespiration in order to make the ATP, so they need more oxygen. So immediately, you're going to be brought out of homeostasis. There's going to be an increased demand for oxygen, and your body, again, the major artery, your carotid arteries, they have different kinds of receptors now. They're called chemoreceptors, and they take a sampling of the amount of oxygen. Send that information again, in this case it's the same, to the brainstem, only now they're comparing it to, well, how much oxygen should be in the blood. And if someone is exercising and that amount of oxygen goes down, you need to maintain it. So this is a response. So one of the things that's going to happen is it's going to target the airway passages. It's going to dilate them, cause them to open up, and that just allows more air with more oxygen to make its way down toward the lungs and eventually into the blood. So once again, we can see here, it's, well, the nervous system that's involved. Once again, the sympathetic nervous system, and also this same hormone that we saw on the previous slide, which was norepinephrine. And that's hopefully going to bring the amount of oxygen in the blood back up to the normal levels.